Welcome to the podcast. Learn English through life, exploring emotions, connections, and the English language.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our podcast, where we dive into topics that touch our hearts and minds. Today, we're talking about something we've all experienced at some point: loneliness. Have you ever felt alone, even when you're surrounded by people? Or maybe you've found yourself scrolling through social media, connected to hundreds of people, but still feeling disconnected? You're not alone in feeling this way. In today's episode, we're going to explore what loneliness really is, why it's so common, and most importantly, how to overcome it. Joining me today are two amazing guests: Emma, who has gone through a tough period of loneliness and will share her story, and Dr. Lucas Morgan, a psychologist who specializes in human connections. Let's get started. Before we dive into personal experiences and solutions, let's first understand what loneliness really means. For some, it's the lack of physical company, but for others, it's a much deeper feeling. So, Lucas, in your opinion, what is loneliness?
Loneliness is an emotional state. It's not just about being physically alone, it's more about perception. You can feel lonely even in a crowded room. In psychology, we categorize loneliness into three main types. Social loneliness, when we lack enough social interactions or connections. Emotional loneliness, when we miss deep, meaningful bonds with close people, like family or partners. Existential loneliness, a more abstract feeling of being disconnected from the world or even yourself, even when surrounded by others.
I can completely relate to that. A few years ago, I was working in a big city, surrounded by colleagues every day. But when I got home at night, I felt empty. It was like no one truly understood me. I had people around, but I felt incredibly lonely.
Wow, Emma, I think many people listening to this can relate to your story. Dr. Lucas, why do you think loneliness is so common today, even with all the technology and social media we have?
It's an interesting paradox. Social media gives us the illusion of being connected, but these connections are often shallow. You might have hundreds of friends online, but feel completely isolated in real life. What our hearts and minds really crave are authentic and meaningful relationships.
So, if I understand correctly, loneliness isn't just about our external situation, but more about how we perceive our relationships or our place in the world.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to understand where this feeling comes from, so we can manage it better.
Thank you so much for that explanation, Lucas. Now that we have a better understanding of loneliness, I think it's time to dive into personal experiences. Emma, you've given us a glimpse of your story, but could you share how you navigated that challenging period?
Of course, Michael. So, as I mentioned, I was working in a big city, a job I had dreamed of for years. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. I had a stable career, colleagues who seemed friendly, and even an apartment in a lively neighborhood. But somehow, I felt disconnected. Every night I'd come home, and instead of feeling accomplished, I felt this heaviness in my chest. I'd sit on my couch, scroll through social media, and see people posting about their happy lives. It made me wonder, why do I feel so alone when everyone else seems so happy? It was like I was surrounded by noise but couldn't hear anyone.
That's such a common feeling, Emma. Social media creates this illusion of connection while actually amplifying our sense of isolation. People post their highlights, not their struggles, so it's easy to feel like you're the only one struggling.
Exactly. It's like you're watching everyone else's movie trailer while living through your own unedited reality. I've been there too. A few years ago, I moved to a new city for a fresh start. I thought it would be exciting, but I quickly realized I didn't know anyone. I'd spend hours in coffee shops hoping someone would magically start a conversation with me. It didn't happen.
Oh, Michael, I've done the same thing. I once went to a bookstore thinking, this is where I'll meet my future best friend. I wandered around for hours, flipping through random books, waiting for someone to strike up a conversation. Of course, no one did. I just ended up buying a book I didn't even want.
I love that. It shows how deeply we crave connection. Sometimes We even romanticize how we'll meet people, like imagining a movie moment where someone bumps into you and sparks fly. But in reality, building relationships takes effort and vulnerability.
Absolutely. And it's not just about meeting people. Sometimes the hardest loneliness is when you're surrounded by people who don't really get you. And I remember being at a family dinner where everyone was talking about their lives, but I felt like I couldn't share mine. Not because they didn't care, but because I didn't think they'd understand.
Oh, that hits home. I remember a time when I felt the loneliest was during a party. Imagine being in a room full of people, music playing, everyone laughing, and yet you feel invisible. I spent half the night pretending to text someone just so I didn't look awkward standing alone.
Emma, you just described every introvert at a party. Honestly, I've done the same. You hold your phone, scroll through old messages, and hope no one notices you're actually texting. No one.
These moments really highlight what loneliness is about. It's not the absence of people, it's the absence of meaningful connection. And often we feel lonelier in a crowd than when we're truly alone.
Lucas, that's so true. I think loneliness also sneaks up on us during transitions in life, like moving to a new city, starting a new job, or even going through a breakup. It's like your life shifts, and suddenly the people who used to fit don't anymore.
Yes. After my breakup, I thought I'd be fine because I had friends. But then I realized that many of those friends were connected to my relationship. I found myself starting from scratch, and that's when I really understood what loneliness felt like.
That's a great example, Emma. Loneliness often comes with big changes because it forces us to rebuild our support system. But those periods can also be an opportunity to reconnect with ourselves and figure out what kind of connections we truly want.
That's such a powerful point, Lucas, and it brings us to a hopeful note. While loneliness is tough, it's also a chance to grow. But before we get into solutions, I want to ask our listeners, have you ever felt like Emma at a party or like me in a new city? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories. Now that we've shared our personal experiences, let's dig deeper into why loneliness happens in the first place. What causes it? And more importantly, how does it impact us emotionally, mentally, and even physically? Dr. Lucas, you're the expert. What can you tell us about the roots of loneliness?
Great question, Michael. Loneliness has many causes, but they usually fall into three categories: life transitions, moving to a new place, starting a new job, losing a loved one, or even just aging can leave us feeling disconnected. Social expectations. We live in a world that often pressures us to appear happy and successful all the time, making it hard to open up about feeling alone. Modern lifestyles. Technology is a double-edged sword. While it connects us, it can also isolate us by replacing real, face-to-face interactions.
That's so true, Lucas. I think life transitions played a big role in my loneliness. When I moved to the city, I thought I'd have this exciting new life. But instead, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. It was like I had no one to share my experiences with.
Yes, Emma, I felt the same when I moved. And Lucas, you mentioned technology. I've noticed that sometimes, even though I'm constantly messaging people or scrolling through Instagram, I still feel disconnected. Why does that happen?
Social media creates what we call social comparison. You see everyone's highlight reels, their vacations, celebrations, perfect relationships, and you start to feel like you're the only one struggling. It's isolating because it makes you think, what's wrong with me? When in reality, everyone has their ups and downs.
That's so true. It's like everyone's life looks better than yours, even though deep down, you know, it's just a filtered version of reality. And Lucas, loneliness doesn't just affect us emotionally, right? I've read that it can actually hurt our health.
Exactly, Michael. Studies show that loneliness can have serious physical and mental health impacts. For example, it increases stress and anxiety levels. It's linked to depression and low self-esteem. Physically, loneliness can weaken your immune system, increase your risk of heart disease, and even shorten your lifespan. In fact, Some researchers say that chronic loneliness is as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that serious. It makes sense, though. During my loneliest times, I wasn't taking care of myself. I was sleeping poorly, eating junk food, and just feeling drained all the time.
Emma, I can relate to that. I remember a period when I felt so isolated that I started binge watching TV shows just to fill the silence. It was comforting at first, but over time, it made me feel even more disconnected from the real world.
That's a common cycle, Michael. When we feel lonely, we tend to withdraw even more, which makes the loneliness worse. It's what we call a self-perpetuating loop. The more lonely you feel, the more you isolate yourself, and the harder it becomes to reach out to others.
That's such a powerful insight, Lucas, and it's something many of us have probably experienced. So, if loneliness can hurt us so deeply, what can we do to break that cycle and reconnect with the world? That's what we're going to explore in our next section. In the next segment, we'll talk about practical solutions and tips for overcoming loneliness and building meaningful connections. Don't go anywhere. We've got some great advice coming up. Welcome back. Now that we understand what loneliness is, why it happens, and how it affects us, it's time to focus on solutions. Let's talk about how we can break free from loneliness and build deeper, more meaningful connections. Lucas, as a psychologist, what's the first thing you'd recommend to someone feeling lonely?
The first and most important step is to acknowledge the feeling. Many people try to ignore or suppress their loneliness, but the more you avoid it, the stronger it becomes. Instead, recognize it as a natural emotion. It's okay to feel lonely. It's a signal that your mind and heart are craving connection.
That's such a good point, Lucas. I used to feel like admitting loneliness was a weakness, but it's actually just a human experience. Emma, how did you start addressing your own loneliness?
For me, it started with small steps. I realized I needed to step out of my comfort zone, so I joined a local book club. At first, I was nervous because I didn't know anyone, but over time, I started building friendships. It reminded me that even small efforts can make a big difference.
That's such a great example, Emma, and it shows that sometimes all it takes is one small step. Lucas, what other practical tips would you recommend?
Here are a few strategies I often suggest. Reconnect with old friends. Sometimes the connections we need are already there, but we've lost touch. A simple message like, "Hey, I was thinking about you. How are you?" can reignite a relationship. Join a community or activity. Whether it's a club, a fitness class, or volunteering, shared interests make it easier to bond with people. Practice self-compassion. Loneliness can make you feel like there's something wrong with you, but remind yourself that it's okay to feel this way. Treat yourself with kindness and patience.
I love the idea of reconnecting with old friends. I actually did that recently. I sent a message to a college friend I hadn't spoken to in years. We ended up meeting for coffee, and it felt like no time had passed. It reminded me that meaningful connections don't always have to start from scratch.
That's so true, Emma. I think we often overcomplicate things, but sometimes a simple phone call or message can make all the difference. Lucas, what about people who feel like they don't have anyone to reach out to?
That's a great question, Michael. If you feel like you don't have a social network, focus on building one step by step. Start by looking for opportunities to connect, like attending local events or even online communities. Also, don't underestimate the power of volunteering. Helping others can give you a sense of purpose and create opportunities for connection.
I love that, Lucas. Helping others can actually help us feel less lonely, too. And speaking of small steps, I've found that even smiling at strangers or saying a simple hello can create a moment of connection. Emma, have you tried anything like that?
Yes. I started making small talk with people at my local coffee shop. At first, it felt awkward, but over time, I got to know the barista and a few regulars. It's funny how these little interactions can brighten your day and make you feel less alone.
That's Amazing, Emma. I think these small acts of connection remind us that we're part of a bigger community. Lucas, do you have any final advice for our listeners who might be feeling lonely right now?
My final piece of advice is to focus on quality over quantity. It's not about having hundreds of friends, but about nurturing a few meaningful relationships. And remember, connecting with yourself is just as important as connecting with others. Take time to understand your feelings, your needs, and what truly makes you happy.
That's such a beautiful note to end on, Lucas. To all our listeners out there, remember, you're not alone in feeling lonely. Take small steps, reach out, and be kind to yourself. You're stronger than you think, and connection is always possible. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've ever felt lonely, we'd love to hear your story in the comments. Your experiences might help someone else feel less alone. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more episodes like this. And remember, you're never truly alone. We're here with you. See you next time.